Welcome to Practical Psychology Podcast, episode 15. I'm Joseph, one of the co hosts. Today, we are very excited to have Brittney Larsen joining us today. Brittney is a BC mental health counselor based in beautiful Nelson, BC, British Columbia. Brittney did her undergraduate degree in education at UBC and then also did her Psychology and History undergrad degree in University of Victoria. And today, Brittany will share a lot of experience about grief, neurodivergence, because she does a lot of individual, couple, family counseling in a trauma-informed, neuro-informed, evidence-based practice here. Welcome, Brittany.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks for having me.
Brittany here. So today you mentioned you're going to talk about grief, but not the typical grief, but the more let's talk about grief. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, so often when we hear the subject of grief, we consider it from the perspective of having lost someone, so bereavement or death-based grief. But I find that more often than not, what I'm focusing on with clients is um, grief that is left less often considered, like disenfranchised grief or secondary losses as the result of grieving.
Yeah, there's a great topic here because it is true. A lot of people, when they thought about grief, is loss, death of things. So, Brittany, tell us more about this enfranchise. What does it mean for a lot of
Yeah.
viewers?
So disenfranchised grief can mean a lot of things. It can start with areas such as miscarriage or infertility. It also can be bereavement based for losses where it's a taboo subject to speak about, such as if you lost a loved one to overdose or to suicide.
Mhm.
So disenfranchised grief is often the kinds of grief that you're not culturally supposed to speak about.
Yeah. Brittany, you just touched on a few topics which is a typical taboo subjects.
Hmm.
Fertility, reproductive health, and losing a family member for non-typical passing or death.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in my own experience, just about 3 years ago, I lost my cousin, who's very beloved to me, to suicide. And I noticed that there were different responses depending on people's comfort level
Mhm.
with the subject. So, this person was someone you would not have expected to pass that way. But thankfully, I come from a family system where grief and loss were nurtured and we were allowed to talk about it in the confines of our family unit. But
Oh
that's
yeah,
not always the
Brittany,
case.
yeah, you mentioned about when something like this happen, there are so many different reactions. Can you tell us a little bit of on in both ends?
Yeah, so some people are very supportive and they show up for you and they allow you to speak about your loved one who passed. But also
Mhm.
sometimes people don't really know what to do. So they
Yeah.
might just not bring up the subject or change the subject, or they may start avoiding you because they don't really know how to respond. Um,
Mhm.
because as a society, this is a newer topic that
Yeah,
people are
okay.
discussing. Because before it would just be hidden. You wouldn't know how someone died, or there'd be sort of a
Mm.
secondary reason given.
Yeah, really tell us a little bit more. Let's say, if somebody show up and they don't know what to say, they try to avoid the subjects. What type of
Hmm.
harm can it be done to the family members?
Yeah, so what ends up happening is you feel like you can't speak about it. So it feels a bit like the person never existed or wasn't
Mm,
important. It
yeah.
also can sometimes feel like your grief is being dismissed or minimized. That may or may not be the intention, but the result is that you get the message, oh, I shouldn't be talking about this.
Mhm. Yeah, and I could imagine when people losing their loved ones, they're in some of the most vulnerable position in their lives.
Hmm. And this can be true as well for like the loss of a relationship.
Mm.
Say that your ex-spouse dies and you're sad,
Yeah.
even though they aren't your spouse anymore, but they were a significant person in your life at one time. But people
Mhm.
misunderstand why the grief is so significant in those circumstances. So that can be disenfranchised as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and Brittany, you mentioned about this misunderstanding can cause a lot of conflicts between
Mhm.
relationships, family relationship, and friendships.
Yeah, so one of the things with disenfranchised grief, and all grieving, because grief for everyone and for every loss will be a completely different experience. So,
Mhm.
within a family, there'll be many different types of grieving. Some people who just want to move on. They don't want to really address it. They would just,
Mhm.
remember the good things and move forward and let's not talk about it anymore. Or there's people who really need to sit in the
Mhm.
grief, but and feel the feelings deeply. But if those two people live in the same household or even are
Yeah.
trying to support
Mhm.
one another, these different grieving styles can really conflict and make the grieving process harder for both individuals.
Oh yeah, Brittany, you mentioned about in the same household because they're living, interact with each other on an ongoing basis, and two major differences here. What are
Mhm.
some of the conflicts that you observe in those households?
So often what happens is um, everyone feels minimized and misunderstood. So
Okay.
there's no wrong way to grieve. Everyone's grieving process
Mhm.
will be different.
Mhm.
The problem exists when sort of the two grieving styles are pushing up against each other and creating conflict
Mhm.
between the individuals. So not only are they grieving, but now they're having difficulties
Mhm.
in their closest relationships as well.
Yeah, in a way, Brittany, you're mentioning they are both trying their best to do the same thing, the grieving,
Hmm.
but getting misunderstood and create all these triggers and conflict, which is unnecessary.
Yes. And it really prolongs grief because everyone gets stuck.
Yeah, and you also mentioned people get stuck, and also the pace, fast and slow, is very personal.
Yes, exactly. So some people feel deeply, but they are able to move on sooner.
Mhm.
Whereas some people, it's a slow process over many years, many decades, because grief never
Mhm.
really ends. We're not searching for a resolution. It's more about
Mhm.
integrating the loss into your life and creating new meaning and kind of growing around the loss and the grief, just having it be
Yeah,
one part of your lived experience.
yeah. Brittany, tell us more about this integration here, because for a lot of people, they learn grief from somewhere, from social media or the television. Is just forget about it and move on.
And one of the most well-known processes is the five stages of grief. So I
Mhm.
believe they are bargaining, anger. Uh,
Mhm.
Now I'm forgetting
Yeah,
what they are. um,
yeah. The denial,
Denial,
sadness, and
sadness.
yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
And so we think that it's sort of this methodical process that you go through to
Ah,
resolve your grief.
mhm.
And I think that that is the common understanding of what grief should look like. Um,
Mhm.
in my life, that has never worked. I
Mhm.
lost a very special family friend who was my mom's best friend when I was a kid. And then my best friend lost her mom when we were in high school.
Mhm.
Pardon me. And what I noticed about those experiences was
Mhm.
I didn't fit into this formula where I could
Mhm.
move forward necessarily. I could feel the feelings in the moment, but then I sort of got stuck with how is it possible this person doesn't exist anymore?
Yeah.
So, in my grieving process, it was more about learning to integrate what was meaningful about that person to me and living accordingly.
Mhm.
So, one of them was really influential for me in chosen family. She was
Yeah.
very, sent me the messaging, even when I was saying my goodbyes, that
Mm,
sometimes your family isn't who you were born into, but it's who you chose. And so, what I tried to do from then on was incorporate her children as my family and her spouse as my family. And I've carried that message
mm,
in many ways throughout my life so that the that she always felt like she was with me because I was taking meaning
mm.
from her loss.
Yeah. And from what you mentioned, this process happened for decades,
Oh yeah, I lost her
not
when I
months.
was 12, and I
Yeah.
think I was about 27 when I realized I had done that.
Yeah, yeah. There is just an example about this.
Yes, exactly. That's one example of
Mm,
so
yeah.
many. And the loss doesn't have to be death. It can be so in my life, I have two young children. And
Mhm.
sort of before your child is born, you have these expectations of what your life is going to look like. Sometimes it's even just you're picturing them living similar to your childhood or
Yeah.
all these things. Um, my first son was born with craniosynostosis, which means that he didn't have a soft spot on the top of his head. And so at 3 months old, he had to have a piece of his skull removed. So
Mhm,
while
mhm.
everyone else around me who had just had babies at the same time was enjoying and frazzled over
Yeah.
the challenges of having a newborn, I didn't get to focus on those things. I had to focus
Mhm,
on some pretty significant medical challenges, which, have been resolved. But it was something
mhm.
that I had to grieve because that is not how I pictured my entry into motherhood. And people have so many versions of this. Like if their baby is very colicky and screams all the
Mhm,
time,
mhm.
that is not how someone pictures their start to parenthood.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And Buddy, you also mentioning about in your example of the post-pregnancy here.
Mhm.
That's typical what is the typical way.
Yeah.
And this also translates so well to psychotherapy and counseling because clients
Hmm.
will come to us talking about a past or this episode of their life. They don't experience the same or the typical way.
Yeah. And it makes it challenging to process it because there's no
Mhm.
model for it and it's not what we think of when we're going to go through these. And a lot of women have this postpartum in a plethora of ways.
Oh yeah, it is a big service demand here because it's not
Hmm.
being well understood by a lot of the
Hmm.
public and a professional is available.
Yes, exactly. And this is an area that I focus on.
Yeah. So, Brittany, from your experience helping people in grief, in different capacity as a teacher, as an educator, as a counselor here, and when people in that stage, how would you encourage them to seek help?
Yeah, so I think a good starting place, because often what's happening is you're feeling minimized, dismissed, and almost
Mhm,
guilty
mhm,
for feeling
uh,
grief and loss.
mhm,
So, a really great place to start in counseling is
mhm,
through exploration. So,
mhm,
exploration of the many factors that are occurring at once and contributing to your
mhm,
experience of
mhm,
grief. So, what I like to say, which I think comes from a quote at one time, but I've since lost that, but where we should spend most of our time initially trying to figure out what the problem actually is and what the root of the challenge is instead of
mhm,
jumping into solutions. Because what if you're not solving the correct problem, or what if you're missing a very important factor that you've never considered before?
mhm, mhm. Yeah. You're talking about in the counseling strategy to really have a slow pace.
Hmm. Which is something that I do have to remind myself frequently because
Mhm,
we live in a results based Western society.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
But sometimes,
Yeah.
in order to get results, you have to slow down first.
Oh, especially when you see the client who are really suffering in that grief, you really want to help them, but at the same time, you have to consciously slow down.
Yes, exactly. So there's a lot going on for me internally that is not being seen.
Yeah. So, Brittany, tell us a little bit more about this enfranchised grief here, and how does it connect to other mental health symptoms, challenges for a lot of clients?
Yeah, so often, I mean, the more recognizable ones that it can lead to are depression and anxiety.
Right.
Um, and also, people who are neurodivergent can sometimes have more trouble processing because they are such big picture thinkers and they're really good at making connections with all sorts of
Mhm,
different aspects of their lives. So, actually, one type of disenfranchised grief is grieving your identity. So, um, it's been more common in the last decade for people to receive
mhm,
diagnoses of various neurodivergence
mhm.
as adults in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even some people in their
Yeah.
70s, um, and
Mhm,
sort
mhm.
of looking back on their life. And there's a lot of what ifs and also sadness for the
Yeah.
person who was being
Mhm,
misunderstood and all the shame that they were bringing upon, like putting on themselves for
mhm,
often the words I hear from clients are not good enough, or
mhm,
I knew I was capable, but I, for some reason, was lazy. So there's these labels that sort
mhm,
of stick and become part of your identity. And so part of grieving is
mhm,
undoing a lot of that identity and then
mhm.
recreating it and recreating meaning in your life.
We're creating the new meanings for today. And yeah, and Brady, you were mentioning about this point here, their identity and how they look at things in a different ways after they get a diagnosis. And some of those ways of looking at things also can be big decisions, choice of relationship, choice of career, which is actively ongoing even today to process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's an
Yeah.
ever present process. So, learning how to move through these aspects can help people to learn skills that they'll carry with them for the rest of their lives and help them in
Mm,
other instances of grief and meaning reconstruction.
yeah. And Brady, tell me more about this. We are helping people suffering from this enfranchised grief.
Mhm.
And what if people don't know that they are suffering that?
Well, and that is the most common thing. So until becoming a counselor, I didn't even
Yeah. Mhm.
recognize that a
Yeah.
lot of the struggles I had had in my young adulthood were related to grief that I didn't recognize as grief. I saw
Yeah.
it as more of a moral failing or a personality flaw that I
Yeah.
couldn't just
Mm,
get over things the way that other people seem to be able to. Um,
mm,
after uh, a lot of learning, it then was so clear that what had happened for me was more based on loss and not knowing
mm.
how to grieve or even that I was grieving at all. And this is a very common experience.
And for yourself, Brit, for your own journey, how do you come to know from I don't know before?
Oh, yeah, that is a really great question. Um, a lot of it was learning and going to
Okay.
counseling myself. And then
Okay.
some of it was starting to recognize patterns in my clients and other people
Mm, yeah.
that were familiar to me, and then doing
Okay.
research to learn more about what could be
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. And in this process, are there any like key individuals or people that sort of like a role model or kind of like blink a light bulb moment?
Oh, yeah, let's see. Off the top of my head, I'm having a trouble coming up with someone, but I did learn a lot from reading Irvin Yalom,
Okay.
who that's someone that everyone reads when they start their master's, but there were certain aspects. There was one part where he was discussing um, um, concentration camps, and
Mm.
that within a horrible situation, just like there's very little choice and freedom, but finding the things you have choice over and utilizing your freedom to choose can give you a sense of purpose um, that really resonates. So, this also in like my personal life has had a lot of meaning because I'm able to take a step back, sort of analyze the situation, and
Yeah.
recognize what I have the freedom to choose and what is valuable for me. Because there's so many external influences in the
Mhm.
world that it can be
Yeah.
hard to know if you're acting from your authentic self or from the
Mhm.
expectations that have been placed on you, and sort of trying to extract what is you and what is not. What is like meaningful for you and what isn't.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. You talk about how much percentage is the expectation and how much is we really want for ourselves.
Hmm. And because we have um, people in our lives that may think differently than us, and there will be external
Mhm.
pressures, it'll never be that you're fully acting from an intrinsic place, so your own authentic
Yeah.
self, because you do have to consider your relationships in this as well. So, say
Mhm.
someone who comes from a culture where well, if we're talking about grief, that there's certain expectations for how you are to grieve. Like
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
um, sit Shiva for 7 days, or you
Yeah.
wear black for an entire year, which is
Mhm.
in Greece. And um, sometimes you will, even if it's not meaningful for you personally, you know that it's culturally important. And so then you still have the choice, you have the freedom to choose and the
Mhm.
responsibility to choose how you're going to respond. And sometimes what's valuable for you is choosing to honor the people that you love in the way that's meaningful for them. But you are still making the choice and responsible for
Mhm.
making that choice, which gives
Oh
you
yeah.
a sense of purpose and sense of meaning.
Yeah. The power of choosing and creating freedom for yourself.
Hmm. And it can be really subtle.
Mhm.
And it's quite
Yeah.
a big concept to start to implement.
And in the counseling sessions, how do you typically implement with a client?
Ooh, that's a really good question. It would very much depend on the scenario and the client, because all of
Mhm.
us have a different readiness for change.
Yeah.
And we might be ready to change in some ways and not in others, because in the past, the things that aren't serving us now were serving us. So it's hard to let go of them sometimes. So,
Mhm.
what I would do is when someone makes a very specific statement or uses a
Mhm.
very specific word, I would want to go deeper with them to understand what that word means for them and what their behavior was, that was how it was helpful to them and whether it's still
Mhm.
helpful to them now. So there's a lot of exploration and going really
Mhm.
deep
Mhm.
on in areas that maybe don't seem like there's depth there.
Mhm. Yeah. And along this point here, when we talk about grief and identity here, it just points to how much importance we have to look at the identity in the grieving
Hmm.
process.
Yes, exactly. And this is something that we're constantly cultivating and changing as humans
Mhm.
because we're always changing and
Mhm.
doing new things.
Yeah. And Brittany, here, another topic I want to ask you is you are also very passionate in neurodivergence and also providing neurodivergence affirming therapy here. Tell us more a little bit about it compared to the long neurodivergent affirming counseling.
Yeah, so this will look again, it's different for every client, but
Mhm.
this is something that I'm really passionate about because there's a lot of neurodivergence in my family. Um, and it sort of started me on a path to how misunderstood this
Mhm.
massive population is. And we're realizing how many people may be neurodivergent even when they don't know it. So, what I try to
Mhm.
do is approach everyone from this space because everyone's brains work different, whether they're
Mhm.
neurodivergent or not. So, if you approach everyone as though their brain is uniquely theirs, then
Mhm.
neuro-affirming care branches out of that because they are the one leading the process and making sure they know they can ask questions, that no
Mhm.
question is silly, um,
Mhm. Mhm.
so that we can really, so that I can really understand them and their point of reference for the world and how they experience the world. And also in the counseling setting, I have to be mindful of like interoception, so internal sensory needs.
Mhm.
Everyone's are different, and some folks might require that I turn the light off behind me so that they can
Mhm.
focus on me. Or some people, I have quite a loud voice. I have a teacher voice, so it
Mhm.
projects. So some folks prefer if I speak quieter. And so I'm mindful of these things and also mindful of people's body language because sometimes they, because of all the responses they've received throughout their lives, they may feel uncomfortable asking someone to
Mhm.
accommodate their sensory needs. And so I try to be very mindful of that.
This is very excellent information for a lot of clinicians, counselors, and psychotherapists to learn more about
Hmm.
this.
Hmm.
And Brittney, tell us a little bit more about what is neurodivergence for people who don't know even the term.
Yes. So neurodivergence essentially means that your brain is working in ways that are different than we typically consider, which would be neurotypical. I'm becoming more and more of the mindset that neurotypical may be not something that exists because everyone's brains do work differently, but it's more the people who are better able to adhere to the societal expectations of, um, yeah, social interactions and sensory
Mhm.
experiences. So, um, in my household, I have a child who has epilepsy, so that it is
Mhm.
considered neurodivergent. I have a child who is
Yeah.
autistic, and that is considered neurodivergent. ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, dyspraxia are all things that fall under neurodivergence, and
Mhm.
more and more things are being added as we recognize how they may have been misinterpreted in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, going along this line here, it touched on the general principle about psychology too, about there are way more things than just willpower,
Hmm.
doing things
Oh
a
my
certain way.
goodness. Yeah, everyone wants to do well. There is no
Mhm.
person out there thinking, I'm not going to try. I just don't care. People may get to that point, but they
Mhm.
didn't start out that way. They received
Mhm.
messages over time that led them either to not try or they don't have the executive function to get started. They don't even know where to
Mhm.
start or how to shift from one task to another. And one of the really great and really challenging things about neurodivergent folks is that they can hyper focus on things. So,
Yeah.
some of the smartest minds in the world who've had the biggest
Mhm.
innovations have been neurodivergent people because they can focus
Mhm.
on something so intensely that then
Mhm. Mhm.
they
Mhm.
can consider every little aspect of it, which so that's
Mhm.
an upside. But if you're intensely focusing on something that maybe doesn't require your attention, that can be really
Mhm.
challenging and leads into things like time blindness or
Mhm.
forgetting appointments and other areas that are more visible to other people and more frustrating to other people.
Oh yeah, Brittany, you also mentioned about those points on how in psychology we look beyond the right and wrong, good or bad, or even strength and weakness, just to understand first. Because you gave out some examples, some of those symptoms, some people can use it for strength, and some can be serious impairments.
Hmm. And in society, say there is a bit of a connection with perfectionism. So
Yeah. Mm,
the research shows that a lot of neurodivergent folks can be quite perfectionistic because they see the big
mm,
picture and they see the consequences if they don't do everything perfectly. So
mm,
perfectionism can be a massive strength, and this is regardless of neurotype. It can be a massive strength, but it can also
mm.
really get in your way because being a
Yeah.
perfectionist when you're building a home and you're making sure that the foundation is secure so that everything you do afterwards, uh because it all relies on the foundation, that is I want a perfectionist builder if I'm ever building a home.
Yes.
However, I when it gets in the way, like if you're being a perfectionist about something that has less gravity to the situation, it can really get in your way as well.
Yeah. And pretty along the same line here, let's say an individual, if they are questioning, am I part of the neurodivergence or not? What should they do?
Yeah, so one of the struggles right now is that there are long wait lists for assessments.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
so I think one of the things you can do is go to counseling, and there are
Mm,
more and more neuro-affirming and
mhm,
informed counselors that are available. Um,
mhm,
and while counselors can't provide assessments, we can help look at the assessment material and discuss whether getting onto a wait list or discussing with your GP or your general practitioner, family doctor,
mhm,
would be an appropriate route for you, or even just exploring why you want to look into it.
mhm. And
There's
pretty,
lots of different aspects.
you are in Nelson, BC. How about in British Columbia? Let's say if people need to get an assessment, do they talk to the doctor or what do they do?
So there are different routes. So my experience has been more with children, which
Oh, yeah.
means because I live in the interior, uh, it's through the government, which is ICANN, Interior Health, and you get on a wait
Okay.
list. But it is the
Okay.
pediatrician who needs to, so you'll have to ask for your general
Mm,
practitioner to then refer you to a pediatrician who can
mm,
then assess whether it would be appropriate
mm,
to be assessed for um, any neurodivergence that seems to be coming up. There are also
mm,
private routes, which can be costly. Some people's
mm,
insurance will reimburse parts of the
mm,
assessment. Sometimes these assessments can be more thorough because the
mm,
psychologist who is doing them, it's a psychologist,
mm,
is specialized in certain areas. So,
mm,
say one area that is less known is PDA, which stands for pathological demand avoidance, which is
mm,
not it sounds a bit like oppositional defiant disorder, but it is not. This one
mm,
is a profile of autism that is a nervous system issue. So
mm,
basically,
mm.
even if your own body is telling you something, it becomes a
Mm.
demand that then you enter fight or flight about.
Oh, yeah.
So there are certain psychologists who specialize in recognizing this presentation of autism, which can be harder to recognize or interpret in the more traditional forms of assessment because it is
Mm.
a lot of research is being currently done on it, on
Oh,
understanding it.
yeah. This is wonderful information because a lot of the parents are wondering about the same thing for their children when they're having
Mhm.
difficulty in schools.
Yeah, and there is a lot of disenfranchised grief in that respect as well, because
Mhm,
people are say things that are meant to be kind, but they say
mhm,
things like, "Oh, your kid couldn't be autistic because A, B, C, or D," or "Well, you
mm,
acted just like that when you were a kid, and look at you now." But it minimizes the experience that the parent is having. the challenges they're having
Mhm.
with their kid. And also, it minimizes the opportunity to reach out for support because early
Yeah.
intervention with neurodivergence, it makes a huge, huge difference. When my
Mhm.
eldest child was in kindergarten, he could barely
Mhm.
attend school. Um, when he was in grade one, he really struggled, but
Mhm.
we learned early on by the end of grade one. And with the help of his teacher and the support of an OT
Mhm.
outside of school and within school, I cannot even begin to explain
Yeah. Mhm.
the
Mhm.
confidence that has emerged in him. And now, when he attends school, there are challenges, but all kids have challenges at school. And he is an incredibly insightful kid who knows how to regulate himself. And a lot of the anxiety and depression and shame that can emerge as a result of all the negative social interactions, people's responses to you throughout your life, that I
Mhm.
can already see the effects of that not happening to him as much. The
Well, so
positive
Brittany, you
effects.
can really see the differences of having professional help compared
Yeah,
to no professional help and being misunderstood.
exactly. And my son did give me permission to use him as an example because he said
Mhm.
he is in third grade and he said,
Mhm.
if my experience helps anybody, then that would be a
Ah,
good thing to do.
wow, yeah. So, Brittany, tell us a little bit about supporting children with neurodivergence. How about on the other side, the supporting for the caregivers? Because what you just mentioned with the OT, other people, you're essentially putting another hat as a social worker or case manager, a paid job, 8 hours, maybe 5 days a week, but you're doing it 24/7.
Yes, exactly. And literally 24/7, as often neurodivergent folks have a harder time sleeping than the average person. So that is actually one of the reasons that I entered the counseling field. That actually had always been my plan from when I was
Yeah.
about 20 onward, but when I was about 35 and had been parenting for quite some time, I realized the strengths that I had from being a teacher and also from the lived experience of navigating the system and helping my kid and grieving what I thought parenthood would going to look like, and then finding meaning in all the ways that it's so much more amazing than I ever thought it could be, and also the hardships that have been really challenging and isolating. It's all the things at once, and so for me, entering into counseling as a practice, I would really love to help support both children themselves and people who are neurodivergent, but also their family members who maybe don't
Mhm.
quite understand the way that their loved one is seeing the world and moving through the world.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
just maybe haven't considered a different perspective on how people process information or what they value.
Oh, yeah, especially with the different generations, new technology, new research, the expectation will be very different.
Hmm. Yeah, because traditionally, what we
Mhm.
tried to do as a in psychology was to modify behaviors to act neurotypical. So this was
Mhm.
very damaging to a lot of people.
Mhm.
While it did give them some skills to function within typical society, it also did a lot of harm to their self-concept. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not good enough, or because I'm this way, there's something wrong with me. But all it is that you
Mhm.
need some accommodations to be able to move through the world as your best self.
Mhm.
There's no such
Yeah.
thing as like less than or not good enough because you
Mhm.
see the world in a different way. It's just learning how what is optimal for you so that you find meaning in your life and you're happy.
Yeah. And Brittany here, let's talk a little bit more about this topic.
Mhm.
Because in the counseling settings, we notice we help the children with neurodivergence, school challenges, and all that. And then we help the caregivers. And then later on, a lot of times it comes to the point the parents themselves is neurodivergent too.
Yes. So this is something that I realized about myself in the process of learning about my both my sons who are differently neurodivergent. So I was always called too sensitive, or that I was making a big deal out of things, or I was called precocious a lot. um, and at the age of, sorry, I need a sip of water. Inhaled something. At the age of, I believe it was 34, I recognized that I have ADHD. But because I never had any behavioral issues, I never was hyperactive physically, my brain was so hyperactive. I am always making like big picture connections, and adults were always kind of blown away by the things that I would say. And so it was never recognized because, yeah, Brittany talks too much in class, but she's so smart. And I was never a problem for anyone except myself because my executive dysfunction made it really hard for me to move through the world once I became a young adult. So this wasn't something that was super challenging for me when I had parents at home who supported me. And I am someone who was lucky enough to grow up with supportive parents. So when I became a young adult and had way more responsibilities, juggling all these things and time management became very challenging for me. But I saw it as a moral failing, like a personal flaw. And so this whole time I had been, because I am the person I am, I have a lot of perfectionist qualities, as I talked about before, can be a connection. Um, these qualities were an overcompensation that helped me to get through the world because I became hyper organized. I became hyper scheduled. I never gave up on a goal, even maybe when I should have, because what would that say about me? And so when I finally figured out what was happening for my brain, and it became very clear that my biggest strengths were also my biggest challenges. But now that I knew what they were, the shame part was gone because I could work with it. It's still frustrating, and I still have times where it's really
Yeah.
challenging. But for the most part, um, it's kind of a non-issue for me because now I can recognize how I see the world, how I move through it, and that I don't have to live my day-to-day life in this prescriptive way that we're told is the only way to succeed.
Yeah. And Brittany, you mentioned about your own personal adult neurodivergence discovery. And then
Hmm.
you also mentioned about the identity because you're really good at perfectionist planning and all that. And for yourself, how do you make this shift of the identity when you discover
Yeah.
all these new things?
So I just made it sound like it was a really easy process,
Yeah.
because now in retrospect, it can sound that way. Um, but what it was is I was consulting with my doctor for over a decade, because we thought that I had anxiety. It turns out that anxiety is very common for people with undiagnosed ADHD, as it is depression, because of the executive dysfunction challenges. You learn that you're probably always going to be frazzled and rushing to an appointment, or you're depressed over all the times you've let people down or let yourself down, and you can't quite understand why. So it was a process of integrating those conceptions of myself and sort of forgiving myself and learning to have grace for the times when I have what I saw as failed. Um, but really just learning to adjust and accommodate for what works best for me. And this happened actually as a practice on learning what works best for my kids.
Mm,
So I had the added bonus of being able to see the benefits for them when we accommodated
mhm,
to their needs. And therefore, I
mhm,
started to accommodate for mine as well. And
mm.
I definitely, because our society has this thing with labels, right? We don't
Yeah.
love
Mhm,
labels.
mhm,
And I didn't want to be known. And even today, I almost didn't talk about this with you because
mhm,
what will people think of me? And
mhm,
what
mhm, mhm,
does this say about me? But really, I'm the same person I've always been.
mhm.
Um, I am a great friend and a great daughter and a great sister. And I have so many parts of my identity that were always this way. Um, and so it doesn't change anything about me, but it did give me more confidence in my abilities after a lot of time integrating this into
Mhm,
my identity and creating new meaning from it instead of just seeing the
mhm,
negatives um, and the things I needed to
mhm.
overcome, but shifting my lens and shifting my view of what this said about me. Because my whole life I didn't think I was, and then I was. So it's just, it can be complicated and it'll be different for every single person and their experience
Yeah.
because my life is so different than other people's lives. It's just,
Mhm.
and my personality is different than other people's personalities. So it's a really, really unique experience, which is why I like to approach it from an existential lens,
Mhm. Yeah.
because what's meaningful for me will not be meaningful for someone else. There's probably neurodivergent people listening to this correcting a bunch of things
Mhm.
I've said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I'm constantly learning. So please, any feedback is welcome. I am still new to this. It's been 4 years since my diagnosis, so I've been in university the whole
Mhm.
time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that just so you know, if I've said something that doesn't resonate for someone, that's okay because your experience is different than mine, and
Yeah.
I'm just
Buddy, you
one person.
mentioning about writing a new chapter and story for a lot of people after they learn about more about themselves.
Yeah. So it's sort of
Mm.
like you look at your past and you rewrite
Yes.
some of the story there. A
Yeah.
lot of it remains the same, but there's a new sort of like hue to it, when you put on rose-colored glasses or just a different
Yeah.
reframe of certain things that were a negative part of your experience, they can still be a negative part, but now there's more
Mhm.
information.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Recognizing the old story and writing the new ones.
Hmm. Which
Yeah.
again comes back around to our choice, even when things are challenging, even when it's not exactly what we wanted or pictured it,
Mhm.
we still have the freedom to choose where we go from here.
Oh, yeah. And Buddy, you mentioned a little bit about the diagnosis and the labels.
Hmm.
And what are some of the examples where the labels can be stigmatizing, not just from others, but internally they're criticizing even more after they have the label to themselves?
Yeah, so this is a common experience, which I kind of did
Mhm,
myself a little
mhm,
bit because I didn't, it was less about how I saw it and more how I was
mhm,
fearing that other people would interpret it. So
mhm,
interestingly, this can go back a bit to grief because you have this sort of ambiguous or disenfranchised grieving process that happens
mhm,
because, in part, because of your interpretation of it, but also in part because of how others may respond. And there are stigmas around certain, like I said before, like a lot of people don't like labels or they
mhm,
misunderstand even what it is. Like if I
mhm,
remember once early when my son had been diagnosed and someone said, "Well, he's very empathetic, so he can't be autistic." But that is a very common stigma that is not accurate. Their
mhm,
empathy may present differently, or their facial expressions may not. recognize it, or they may not process it in that moment and then recognize later the bigger picture versus what they were focused on
Mm,
then. Um, but from my experience of being a teacher, the neurodivergent kiddos that I worked with were some of the most empathetic people I've ever met. They
yeah.
feel what other people are feeling, which is why sometimes their behaviors are so big. I mean, and I'm generalizing,
Mm,
so this is not everyone, but as a whole, yeah. And from what the research shows, that's not true. It's a very common misconception that there's no empathy.
mm. So today, Brittany, we talk about many important topics. We would love to have you back here to talk more.
Yeah, anytime. Both those subjects could be an entire career's worth of conversations. There's so much to get deeper into.
And Brittany, let's say if any viewers or other clinicians want to get in touch to learn more about neurodivergence, disenfranchised grief, and how can they contact you?
Yeah, so I will attach my contact information below. Um, but I do have an email, which is blcounselingpsych@proton.me. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm just starting a YouTube account, which please bear with me because being on camera makes me very uncomfortable, but I'm getting better all the time. So I'll keep trying and you keep trying too.
And for all the viewers, we'll put all the links in the description. And thank you, Brittany, for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Joseph, so much for having me.